All right, Dr. Dale McKinley is a political activist and writer, member of the coordinating committee of Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia. Dr. McKinley, a pleasure to have you with us here on SABC News. Thanks so much for being with us, sir.
Thanks, Flo, and to the viewers as well.
All right, let's talk about the Home Affairs Minister's appeal, which will suspend the earlier court ruling protecting ZEP holders. Does this leave the ZEP holders in limbo in the meantime, pending that appeal? Of course, we know that the Helen Suzman Foundation has indeed approached the courts, but what would it mean had the Helen Suzman Foundation not indeed done that?
Well, under normal circumstances, when a court judgment is appealed, the order goes into abeyance. In other words, it is stayed.
Yeah.
And that's why Helen Suzman clearly felt the need, because as Nicole Fritz indicated, they first approached the Department of Home Affairs to see if they would cooperate and say, look, this is where our argument is. Would you be willing to guarantee that you won't act against ZEP holders? And they said, no, we won't. So they really had no other option in this case but to go to court. So essentially what this does is as they are asking, it preserves the order, which means you cannot go ahead and deport ZEP holders or to arrest them for not having the right papers. And I think it would be consistent with the order that was given by the court. And it makes logical sense that while this is being considered and what the ultimate decision, that the ZEP holders would be able to stay and continue working and live their normal lives.
Yeah, there is this view that this was an attempt by the Home Affairs, Department of Home Affairs and the Minister himself to sort of push people towards undocumented migration. Of course, that's a theory, and I wonder if that's a theory that you support or you agree with, almost in an attempt to make this an issue of illegal migration, and in that way be able to take them out pending this decision. Do you think that the thinking went as far as that when it comes to, to the Department of Home Affairs?
Well, at this stage, I wouldn't put anything past the DHA. I mean, Aaron Motsoaledi has made it clear. I mean, he hasn't been very shy about this. He's made it clear that he wants all the ZEP holders to leave the country. In fact, he's made it very clear in the last 2 or 3 years that he believes that the vast majority of immigrants from the rest of the continent should not be in South Africa. So I think his personal opinion would probably be consistent with that. The Department of Home Affairs itself is in deep trouble. And the reason why we've got the situation we have is not simply because there are lots and lots of immigrants without documentation. Yeah. It's because the Department of Home Affairs is quite dysfunctional when it comes to issuing the necessary permits. And this is not simply about poor migrants coming from Zimbabwe or Mozambique. It's skilled migrants coming from other countries that have been trying to get work permits. It's people that have been trying to get spousal permits, study permits, extra visas. You ask anyone, and they'll tell you that Home Affairs, it's a nightmare. So it's very rich of the minister and of Home Affairs to be pointing fingers at people who are desperate and vulnerable while their own house is clearly in disarray.
Yeah, but in future, how should the issue of migration be dealt with? And it seems as though this in particular has become sort of albatross around the neck of the Minister, Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi. It's of course an issue that should be dealt with, but how should it be dealt with going forward?
Well, yes, I don't think anyone would argue that there's not a need for reform and there's not a need for some review of the dispensations in regards to immigration. The question is, how did we go about doing that? The answer is not to deport hundreds of thousands of people and to victimize people who are desperate. It's to start beginning to review the legislation in an open, transparent, and participatory manner. This was one of the reasons why the court overturned the DHA decision on the cancellation of the ZEP, was precisely because it had done absolutely no consultation. And when the court asked it to produce evidence, it refused. So once again, if the DHA is not going to come and put its cards on the table and say, this is our plan, this is what we plan to do, we plan to consult with these particular groups, we're going to introduce this legislation. When we pass legislation in this country, when we review it, we do it we have our constitution that said it should be an open, transparent, and participatory process.
Yeah.
We are not a dictatorship. We're not an authoritarian state where you pass legislation behind the backs of the people. So DHA must take its mandate seriously. And I don't think any of us have the answers right now as to exactly what that legislation would look like, but it certainly needs to be one in which everybody has a say in that, and it is done in a proper and participatory manner.
Dr. McKinley, I would assume that, this is a very important case, just going forward, and the sort of, I suppose, precedent that it would then form for South Africa, particularly when we're talking about issues pertaining to human rights. There is a potential, isn't there, that this could put, sort of a black stain or a black mark on South Africa's human rights record. I mean, we seem to pride ourselves in, having this wonderful human rights record. One can debate that. It's, of course, debatable. But could that, could this then put a black mark, depending on how, this all sort of plays itself out?
Yes, I mean, we've already had reviews by the United Nations Office for Refugees, as well as for Human Rights, that have made some very, very critical remarks about the way in which the South African government has approached these issues. And it is quite ironic. I mean, it sounds like a broken record, but in many cases, when we invoke the past, when we invoke the apartheid past to explain why we're in situations we're still in today, which is a legitimate reason, we must also remember that that history is full of the kinds of principles and values that the ANC itself and the government itself imbibed about internationalism, about our African brothers and sisters, Ubuntu, these kinds of things. And now all of a sudden, because there's elections, because people are desperate, because our economy is not working, because the ANC as the governing party has, under its own admission, failed to deliver on many, many fronts, who's the easy victim? Migrants. Yeah. So yes, there is a fundamental problem here, not only with the politics of this, but with the morality and the ethics of it, which calls into question why would a party of liberation, a party that embraced Africanism and embraced a Pan-Africanism, now turn its back on those very ethics and principles simply for electoral circumstances or for the fact that they're going to get some political support by taking these positions from particular constituencies.
Why would they get political support for taking that particular position?
Because people are desperate. I mean, if you go into, we have an expanded unemployment rate of upwards of 45%, a youth unemployment rate of upwards of 70%. People then, when you have a politics of fear and of desperation, we've seen it in the United States, we see it in Europe, South Africa is not unique. You turn to those that are most vulnerable and the easiest targets, and those are migrants. We're seeing it all over the world. So that's why, and when elections come along, we see Action SA, we see the Patriotic Front taking very, very, very xenophobic kinds of positions and saying, deport them all, they must move, it's only South Africans that must get the treatments in hospitals and so forth and so on. So the ANC in some ways is not certainly is the middle ground in some ways, but it's moving. I mean, if you listen to our president the other day at the ANC conference, he basically said, our big problem is illegal immigrants. Yeah. He would not have said that 2 or 3 years ago. In fact, he said the exact opposite. He said, we mustn't play the blame game. We mustn't do this. So you can see the politics is shifting, and it's shifting as we get closer to elections because political parties realize that there's capital to be made into having this kind of discourse. And that's very, very dangerous.
Dr. McKinley, you talk about the issue of unemployment, and that is an important issue, specifically when we're talking about South Africans. Is it justifiable to label South Africans as xenophobic when they're saying that we have limited resources, and then we have our brothers and sisters from other countries, and the resources become even more limited, and that has made South Africans be called names like xenophobic when they're pointing to the issue that there are no opportunities, there's unemployment. We sometimes get to hospitals and there's no beds for us as South African citizens. Are some of these things that are being said not being heard? And I know you're saying that this is all political ploy or something to get votes, but some of these things that are raised by South Africans, surely they are making sense and not necessarily shouldn't be viewed necessarily as being xenophobic, since you are in fact a citizen of the country.
Listen, nobody is saying, and certainly we're not saying, that there are not legitimate grievances that are being raised. Of course there are. The question is who's to blame for those grievances and where the problems lie. So let's take the health, for example. This misinformation that is being pushed, that foreigners are overwhelming the health system. If we go to the facts, and we've done this as Kopanang, we've done this, many other researchers have done this, have shown that, in fact, in the vast majority of cases, that it's a very minimal percentage of foreign nationals that are in the health system. The same would go for the educational system. But because we have social media, because there's a lot of misinformation, we say, you see it with Trump in the United, the Mexicans are taking over the United States. The immigrants are denying us our national identity as Americans. In this case, it's South Africans. So there's a fine line here, which is, yes, there are legitimate grievances, and yes, there are issues of homelessness, there are issues of joblessness, there's issues of education and health system. But if every South African were to ask themselves and sit back rationally and logically and say, okay, where does that problem really arise? They would come to, most of them would come, and I believe they do come to the conclusion that it's not Zimbabweans that are to blame, it's not Angolans or Mozambicans, it's our own policies and our own government which has failed to deliver on health and education and otherwise. It's not migrants that are to blame. That doesn't mean that there aren't problems in the immigration system that need to be fixed. What we are asking for is a rational, peaceful, non-inflammatory conversation and process where we can start talking about these problems and deal with them in a real way that does not victimize those that are most vulnerable and marginal. If we begin to do that, and if people allow this kind of discourse to happen, we are going to be no better than the Trumps. We're going to be no better than the right wing in France or in Europe that we criticize all the time in terms of their racism and their xenophobia. And that's not to say that most majority of South Africans are xenophobic. I don't believe that. I believe that we have a very small vocal minority which are so.
All right, you speak about vulnerability. Just to wrap up our conversation, we obviously don't know how the minister's appeal will go, but perhaps as part of your research, you would have kind of figured out the kind of situations would put these migrants in should things go the way of the Home Affairs ministers, and no doubt one would assume it would leave the ZDP holders quite vulnerable. If things go the minister's way.
Certainly. I mean, I don't think we can sort of second guess what the courts are going to decide. This is an important constitutional argument. Remember, the High Court said this was unconstitutional and invalid. So it's not just a question of reviewing a small amount of a piece of legislation. It's a constitutional issue. And I think this is where the nub really lies. We adopted a constitution in 1996, which was very socially progressive on many fronts. What has happened in the next 27 years after that is that the realities have hit hard, economic and social realities that have attacked many of the principles and values that underlie that constitution. And many people are beginning to say we need to change that. That's not just a political issue. It's a national societal issue that all of us must engage in, because once we begin to start messing with the Constitution, which I'm not saying we cannot amend it, it cannot be changed, of course it can. But once we begin that process, we must be very careful that reflects what we really ultimately believe in. So not for exigent circumstances, not because we're desperate or angry, but because we fundamentally believe that this is the right thing to do. And that should not be done in haste. It shouldn't be done in anger. It should be done maturely and responsibly.
All right, Dr. Dale McKinley, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for giving us your time.
Thank you.
Dr. McKinley is a political activist and writer, member of the coordinating committee of Kopanang Africa Against Xenophobia.